Some of you seem to think that Homarid is an interesting card to talk about. So, what the hell? Let's talk about Homarid. Homarid is a 2/2 creature from Fallen Empires that costs 2 and a blue mana. Put a tide counter on Homarid when it is brought into play and during your upkeep. If there is one tide counter on Homarid, it gets -1/-1. If there are 3 tide counters on Homarid, it gets +1/+1. When there are 4 tide counters on Homarid, remove them all. Wow, what a powerful creature ability. Homarid is interesting for a few different reasons, but the ability is surprisingly confusing for how not good that it is. It is also potentially thematic, but there are some issues with its flavor as well. But let's start with the actual ability first and make sure we understand what the hell is going on here. When you cast this creature, it is a 1/1 that you spent 3 mana on. The next turn, it's a 2/2, which is on rate to being about as playable as Grey Ogre. Then, the turn after that, it's a 3/3, which is absolutely massive for a creature you spent 3 mana on. Wow. That's actually not a joke, that's like a really good rate back in the day. Anyway, then the turn after that, it's a 2/2, which is on rate to be about as playable as Grey Ogre. Then on the 5th turn, it's a 1/1 again. Then it's a 2/2 again, and then a 3/3 again, and then a 2/2 again, and then a 1/1 again, and so on and so forth. And from a strictly flavor aspect, this is pretty cool. It tells the story of the changing tide, and in the lore, Homarids are known for being clumsy and slow out of water, so this ties that mechanic to the narrative quite well. That's pretty interesting, but the execution has some drawbacks to it. The main issue this card has from a flavor perspective is that different copies of Homarid being cast on different turns will be experiencing different levels of the tide on the same battlefield. That's kind of interesting from like a tactical standpoint, because if you cast one Homarid while you have a Homarid that's a 3/3, then you'll always have a Homarid at 3/3 while the other is at 1/1, and they'll both be 2/2s at the same time. That's mechanically interesting in its own way, but it likely doesn't accomplish much more than confusing both you and your opponent. It also doesn't make sense narratively, especially when you consider Tidal Influence is in the same set. Tidal Influence is a little different, but for the most part it functions the same way, except that it affects all blue creatures and not just the creature it's stapled on. So if there is a Tidal Influence on the field, each Homarid in play is experiencing 2 potentially different levels of tide at the same time, and each of those Homarids might be experiencing a different level of tide with the... It gets a little confusing, right? Narratively, it's kind of stupid. Now, to be fair, this is a dumb thing to complain about, and none of this really matters, but I do find it interesting that this mechanic... it's not a mechanic because it's not keyworded and stuff like that, but this attempt at a card design kind of just falls flat both mechanically and narratively. I don't know. It's a good idea, but it has some shortcomings. It's also just not good. I did spend a bit of time talking about some of the mechanical interactions that a person could reasonably find interesting, but the harsh truth of Homarid is that this card sucks. And this isn't a good thing to be spending your time on. There are ways to break this, probably, I guess. And there are probably pretty funny things to do with this as well, but at no point in the game's history was this ever an optimal thing to try to do. It's also weirdly half-baked, because, like, Homarid is probably the face of the Homarid creature type, right? Because the creature type is in the name. So you would think its effect would kind of key you into what the creature type is about, but Homarid is the only one of like 8 Homarids in the game that cares about this at all. That's probably for the best. Like, this isn't a good thing to base an entire creature type around, but it is still kind of interesting that the one Homarid goes hard on this and the other ones just don't care. And it is probably for the best that they don't, like, print cards like this anymore, but it is still, like, interesting, curious, and a bit weird that the namesake card is complicated and stupid, and none of the other Homarids care about this kind of thing at all. Homarid is really interesting, and its unpopularity isn't entirely its own fault. Homarids were introduced in Fallen Empires, a set that's actually pretty interesting in its own ways, with some pretty fun cards, but it was very overprinted, which dulled much of the enthusiasm for these cards. Homarid is probably one of the cheapest Magic cards in the game, at least of the older cards. Still, the sins of Fallen Empire aren't necessarily Homarid's sins, and it is interesting for ways that are outside of, like, how the set was handled. Normally I don't dig too deep into the lore-related things in these little videos, but Homarid does have some pretty cool lore, so I'm going to give a brief overview in case you don't know anything about Fallen Empires. So in short, Urza activated the Golgothi Silex to conclude the Brothers' War. This caused a catastrophic series of events that cooled the plane of Dominaria and kicked off an ice age. The Dark is not what we're talking about, but it is a set that took place around the shifting culture around magic users after the sun disappeared on Dominaria, but before the cooling effect had a chance to blanket the planet in ice. Fallen Empires also takes place during this turn of events before the Ice Age would take hold of Dominaria, and the events of this set take place on Sarpedia. As the climate changes and various food sources become less reliable, the groups of people start to have conflicts. Since this lore dump is happening on a video about Homarids, I won't focus on all the colors and all the clans and tribes and all that stuff. I'll just focus on the conflict between the Homarids and the Voldalian merfolk. Basically, the water started cooling and the areas around Sarpedia became ideal environments for the Homarids. So they kind of just moved in onto the Voldalian turf and just started killing Voldalians and hunting their food sources. That's the reason Fallen Empires focuses on 2 creatures per color and why the Homarids were even invented. The story needed a secondary sentient water creature person, and they went with Grab People, then pretty much dropped the concept entirely. Honestly, I do think it's a pretty cool concept in its own way, and I do think the lore of this set would be much more appreciated if the set wasn't like such a giant joke. And yeah, Homarid itself is a pretty ambitious card, actually. It is a bit of a joke, and it's not very playable, but I do really appreciate that it's trying to tell a story that's so big. It ends up being convoluted and kind of a terrible game piece, but it tried to be something different, and I respect that. It's really stupid to do this in the same set as Tidal Influence, though. I think Tidal Influence is a more successful attempt at trying to add tidal mechanics to Magic, but I also, like, don't know why you would bother. This is not, like, fun or interesting, I don't think. I don't know. I do think that these kind of mechanics are stupid and unnecessarily burdensome to track, but I do like that they tried to do something, right? Homarid has only ever been printed in Fallen Empires, and it'll probably never need a reprint based on demand versus supply, but it does have 4 different arts, because Fallen Empires made the bold decision to give multiple arts to each common in the set. I don't personally hate this idea, but I think it was implemented poorly and also unlucky to be implemented on a set that would be overprinted and eventually seen as a failure. It's cool that people have more access to game pieces, but when you're cracking Fallen Empires packs because you're a broke kid, and you open up a pack with 2 Homarids and 2 Thalids with different art, and you already have like 20 of each of them, it kind of adds to the negative emotions of the concept of having multiple art on your commons. But it is pretty cool to have different representations on cards, so you could pick your favorite or have more art in your deck. So let's talk about the art. Fallen Empire's card number 19A, or Homarid A, was illustrated by Quentin Hoover, and this is probably my favorite Homarid art. I love this art so much because Quentin managed to put such an insane amount of personality into this lobster monster, and I think that's fantastic. The line work is great, the contrast between the subject and the background is insanely well done, and the texturing on the card is sick as hell. It also gives me the slightest hint of watercolor, which I think is topical for art depicting a shrimp man. Yeah, Quentin did a fantastic job on this one, but the other arts are pretty good too. So let's talk about Fallen Empire's card number 19B, also known as Homarid. Homarid B is not in my top 2 favorite Homarid arts, but it's okay. I do appreciate the weird amount of sass that I'm interpreting from this art, and the details are pretty sweet. I really like the kind of dopey face on the one that's turned and looking at the camera. It's also really funny to see a creature with a carapace and claws wielding a spear. That just tickles me personally. It's just kind of absurd in such a fun way. Yeah, fuck, I don't know. I don't have much to say about this one. Hey, it's editing me with bad lighting and no fucks given about my appearance. I forgot to say, Heather Hudson illustrated this version. Heather Hudson did a good job. Sorry. Moving right along, Homarid C was illustrated by Mark Keaton, and if Art A wasn't my favorite, then Art C would definitely be. This piece is so fantastic. I love it so much. The first thing I appreciate about this art is the Homarid having a weapon that makes more sense for like a weird lobster thing to use. I also appreciate that its legs are like messed up and not something that looks like it would walk well on land, because it fits the story of these things being stronger when the tide is high since they have trouble walking on land. I also think the Homarid looking at the camera is one of the funniest things in magic art. This goofy fucker just brings me such joy. The line work and the choices in this art are just fantastic. Like, this card is really good. The contrast is also nice. All of it's great. But let's move on. Last is Homarid D by Brian Walkwitz, and this is my least favorite of the Homarid arts, but I don't hate it. I think it's really fucking goofy in its own way, and I think it's pretty fun. The lobster tail is especially hilarious. I like this art, but it just doesn't make me as happy as the other Homarid arts do, so. Okay, yeah. I think that's all I can really think to say about Homarid. It's a pretty funny card, and definitely a curiosity. I'd love to hear what you guys think of Homarid. Do you wish the creature type got more support? Are you tired of Homarids being treated as a joke? Are you physically disgusted that Hullbreaker Horror isn't a Homarid? Let me know what you think. And as always, you can like the video if you liked it, you can subscribe if you give a shit. But either way, I hope you have a magical day. Thank you for watching.